Still nice to see you here today. Good job. Nice to hear the Corley brothers rocking out on the percussion. So we're in Exodus again today. It's going to be a full year before God's glory cloud moves Moses and the Israelites from Sinai toward Canaan, from the smoke and the lightning and the thunder toward the milk and honey. And that's the big story of where we're going. And you can read about their departure in Numbers 10. It's going to be a lot of scripture in between now and when they go. But when we open to Exodus 24, as we do this morning, they have been camped at Sinai probably less than a month. They've received parts of the law. We know that already. But there's no tabernacle yet. There's some priests of some sort, but God hasn't told them yet how to consecrate Levites, or he hasn't given Aaron the job as a high priest. In chapter 24, they haven't heard of any of those things yet. And they don't think of God as the one who condescends to dwell among them as he will in the tabernacle. But they see him as an awesome God up on a mountain, on a smoking hot mountain, the God he is the consuming fire. He's the God who keeps you at a distance. You don't wander too close to that mountain or you might die. You come there only if and when and how he says. And the last thing that any Israelite expected to do in his lifetime would be to look at God, actually see the holy God and live to tell about it. I believe that this chapter is the towering high point in Israel's history. You might debate about what the low point would be. I would say it would be when the nation rejected Jesus and sent him off to the Romans to be crucified. You could debate about the high point too, I guess. You might wonder if maybe it was when they crossed the Red Sea, they sang the victory song. But that was something that God did entirely without their help. Horse and rider thrown into the sea, God did that. And that was the high point for him, for sure. And in their history, maybe in that way. But I'm searching for their best day, when they were at their best, when they most clearly and faithfully responded to God as redeemed people ought to. And it actually started back in chapter 19, right before God thunderously spoke from the mountain. And that's when they honored God by committing themselves to live according to whatever God their deliverer wanted. And so before they ever heard one thing of what God would require of them, they said in unison, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. They vowed to obey God, whatever he puts on the table. That was chapter 19. So in chapter 20, God starts putting things on the table. For 4 chapters, starting with the 10 Commandments. But now we're in chapter 24. So after these 4 chapters, where God is giving stipulations that they've agreed to in advance, will the people pull back? Buyer's remorse. Wow, if we had known this is what we agreed to, can we get out of this contract? We would not have spoken so rashly. But no, twice in Exodus 24, the people again make their blanket vow to obey. Once after the commandments and laws in chapter 23 are recited to them, they say, all the words that the Lord has spoken we will do. And then a third time, after the commandments and laws are read to them, they've been written down now, and they are read to them, they have seen the fine print, and they still say, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and then they add, and we will be obedient, we will hear. They've got a chance to back out, but they don't. And then they get something that makes us know that it can't get any better than this. It's something that never happens to them again. And it's something that their representatives, their 70 elders of Israel, as we'll see, in going up to the mountain, they experience this thing where they actually see God, it says. We'll have to figure out what that means. They actually see God, but they sit down and eat and drink. Verse 10, they saw the God of Israel, and they didn't die. And verse 11, they beheld God, they gazed at God, and they ate and drank. Now, I don't know what's on your bucket list, but I have yet to hear anyone publicly unveil their list and come out with number 42. Oh yeah, and before I die, I want to see God sometime and do lunch with him. Lots of people have a dream to meet some celebrity. How many of you have met a celebrity? All right? Some have met a president. I know the Lennoxes went down and met with President Reagan after he was out of office. Maybe a big-name entertainer. Anybody? An entertainer. A world-renowned scholar or an author. All right? Could be anybody. How about a sports figure we would all know? All right? How about a Disney character? Let's just put it to that. You've been to Disneyland. You got to see Mickey in person. All right? Now, I'd be interested if your celebrity, this is a kooky question, I know this, Eddie Mae. Yeah, I'd be interested if your celebrity happened to have your name on their list of people that they wanted to meet before they die. Maybe actually name one of their kids after you. No? Well, I know when I met Boston great, Boston Celtics center Bill Russell. One time I was coming home from someplace where I was, Chicago, I think, and waiting for luggage at the airport. I recognized him, and I went up to him and asked him for an autograph. And he looked way down at me, and here we are in an empty airport at 2 a.m. There's nothing else to do. And he's just back in the corner by himself, and he said this, "I don't give autographs." Now, he was evidently not all that giddy about meeting me. And I'm pretty sure that he didn't name any of his kids Bruce. In fact, he had 2 boys named Bill Jr. and Jacob. And then I read later in 2013 he got arrested for bringing a loaded 38 into the SeaTac airport. So I was glad I didn't really pursue it and get into an argument. Now, there's some people that you'd be thrilled to meet, but you know it could never happen, such as they already died. There's a website that I was checking. People could write down the greats from history that they would most like to have known. And the lists vary immensely, but they almost all have, some great thinker from the past or, the typical presidents. One lady had Theodore Roosevelt, there's one, Jane Austen, an author, Winston Churchill, Wilberforce, good choice. And then, oddly, the list ended with Coco Chanel and James Garfield, explaining her choice of President Garfield in this way. And that's the picture up here. And I'm sure you all recognized him. But she says, "Mostly because I think it's tacky we forget he was ever president." In other words, a mercy choice. I mean, she could have put me down if she just had a pity vote for waste. But of course, I wasn't dead yet, so I guess didn't qualify. But now here's an interesting thing. She didn't include an apology for leaving out Jesus. I had to scroll down through 21 lists before I found anyone even mention Jesus. And another 50 lists before I found the second. And it never occurred to most people that it would be interesting to know Jesus. Now, this was on librarything.com. And just one person I could find put Jesus at number 1, followed by his mother Mary, followed by Mozart, and then St. Francis, St. Patrick, King Arthur, Lord Byron, Dickens, and the great soprano Maria Callas. Another website solicits stories from people about how they managed to meet their greats. These would be the living ones, I would imagine. And often it had to do with paying money. So I was thinking about this question, how much would you pay? And so the stories were ranged from, you're home from your honeymoon, way to go. Anywhere from $500 up into the thousands of people, to just attend a meet and greet with their most favorite celebrity. And maybe it involved winning a contest for charity where they could go backstage and meet a celebrity after his or her performance. Some of you maybe have done that. Well, you may not believe this, but I didn't find one anecdote where the celebrity had offered money to spend time with some ordinary cat like us. Shows you what they know. Well, it made me wonder how much people would pay to go backstage with God. How much would you pay for a chance to see God up close and personal and have coffee with him? And I'm pretty sure most people have never thought about that, but if they have, they're probably a little kooky and spooky. But what kind of person actually thinks about meeting God? And how would they ever imagine that happening unless they, maybe they had to die first and meet him, sort of the afterlife thing? Who has ever imagined something like what happened here in our chapter, like what happened to the Israelites at Sinai, where they go up to the mountain of doom and they actually dine with the mighty God? Who has ever decided to climb Mount Rainier on the off chance of reaching the snowy summit and find a cool cave where God lives and cooks burgers for tired hikers? Only people who are probably living at Western State Hospital, God bless them. But actually, it is the most fantastic thing ever, and I think that's why no one thinks about it. As long as God is smiling and is not like Bill Russell. But look, not only do the Israelites come through with the best thing they will ever do, how they wholeheartedly and unreservedly articulate their obedience to the God who redeemed them from Egypt, but then they experience the best thing a human being could ever imagine, a visual encounter with the living God and a friendly meal in his presence. And in this case, for a change, was probably not manna. It would be more like a steak dinner, if I guess right. And that's why I say this chapter is the high point in their history, because neither of these great things ever happens again. Now let's fill in the holes of this story. I want you to open to Exodus 24:1, and we'll get some of the verses up here if you don't have a Bible. Right after that long list of regulations that we went over last week that start to tease out the details of the Ten Commandments, or what are called the 10 words of chapter 20, during this chapter you're going to see Moses going up and down the holy mountain. Not every lap is mentioned, however, and it gets a little confusing, but just don't let that distract you. Moses is reviewing for a new generation how the Mosaic covenant was originally ratified. And it starts here with verse 1. Then he, that's Yahweh, and this, by the way, while Moses is still up in the mountain, he has just received the law, and now the Lord's going to send him down the mountain to gather a group of people together to come back up. And so he said to Moses, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, and then two people, I don't know if you know who these are, Nadab and Abihu. These are the two oldest sons of Aaron. Now, let me just pause for a second, because the second generation will be reading this account, and they will already know that these two sons of Aaron are ones that God condemned to death in Numbers 3 for false worship, what's called strange fire. Why not just omit them from the story? Unless Moses is trying to be very historical. He's telling the facts here. He doesn't leave the bad guys out, because that would ruin the story. I like that about the Bible, that it doesn't try to sugarcoat anything. But Moses, I think, is trying to subtly remind this generation that that are now ready to go into the land, that a privileged beginning does not guarantee a flawless ending. There's another group going with them, the biggest group, the 70 elders of Israel. We've read about these elders back in beginning in chapter 3, verse 16. We've never been told how they got recognized, probably just the older men, patriarchs, calls them chief men in verse 1, probably including the other guys that go up too. But 70 is a number of completeness in the Bible, and so these elders seem to represent all the people. Can't have everybody going up, but so they're chosen to go up in their place, because this is a covenant thing between God and Israel. Now look what happens. Here's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to come up and worship from afar. And that is the main purpose or thing going on in this chapter. They're summoned to go up and bow the knee to God and the one who is making this treaty with them, to honor and to adore the God who saved them. Although they must not expect to get too close, it says. It says from afar. It says that these men must worship from afar, which means that the privilege and capacity to come right up to God was not for everyone, as you'll see in the next verse. And of course, you reflect on the fact that when the Holy of Holies is built, only one person could go in there once a year. And so just because you were an Israelite doesn't mean you could just go right into the place where God's holy presence, glorious presence was being known. And so it says in verse 2, Moses alone, this is God talking, Moses alone shall come up near to the Lord at the mountain's peak, but the others shall not come near. So they're going to go, imagine them going, halfway up or maybe halfway down, depending if you're a half full or half empty person. And the people shall not come up with him, that is with Moses. The people are to stay at the foot of Sinai, although they will be included in their representatives, the elders. Now we go to verse 3, because at this point, there's an interlude between these two. Moses came, it says, and told the people. And so he's come down the mountain, and all these things that happen on the passage that we have on the screen right now happen before they go back up, as instructed. So it says in verse 3, Moses came. Moses now comes down to the people. He's gotten everything from the 4 chapters of the law that precedes, as well as these instructions. This is before they go back up in verse 9. And he says it told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules. Now I've highlighted 3 words here: told, wrote, and read. He told the people the words. He wrote down the words of the Lord. And then down in verse 7, he read in the hearing of the people what had been written. All 3 of these things are the same content. So first of all, he tells the people. The words are the 10 words, and the rules are the many laws that follow the Big 10, called also the Book of the Covenant once it is written down. And that's all the stuff from chapters 20 to 23. Those will be greatly expanded on if you continue reading through Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, because there's a lot more to the law and to this covenant that has yet to be given. But the basics are there, and so this is what he tells them, and then he's going to write it down and he'll read it. The first time these people actually hear the stipulations of this treaty, as I said before, they will react like this. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Now we're in the middle of a ratification ceremony as God is making a covenant with his chosen nation. And so this is the vow or the oath that was required in a vassal treaty of that day, sort of like the signature of a treaty in our day. As God cuts this agreement that describes what is required of those that he is going to protect, then they must state their agreement to keep their part of the treaty. And this is how they do it. They all state together, we will do all the words that the Lord has spoken. Now, another regular part of the treaty process was the formal reading of the terms of the treaty. So that's why we have the writing and the reading part. Written in verse 4, read in verse 7. Verse 4, Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. So the pillars are these tall stones that are put on end, symbolizing the witnesses of the covenant around the central altar. Now, why an altar? Well, first of all, both parties are being represented. The altar for God, let's just highlight these a little bit. By the way, if you're marking notes, if you brought colored pencils, that will help. But forgot to tell you to do that. But if you circle altar and pillars, you see these 2 parts, the altar standing for God and the pillars standing for the 12 tribes. Now, why do you need an altar? Because there are going to be sacrifices for the consecration of the people. Now, evidently, some of the basics of the sacrificial system that will be explained in great detail when you read the beginning of the book of Leviticus, these were already being practiced. There were plenty of altars in Genesis where these sacrifices were common. And so in verse 5 it says, and he, perhaps under exact instructions from Yahweh, sent young men of the people of Israel. Do we have any young men here? All right, raise your hand if you're a young man. All right, so we would send you out to bring in the animals because we need some young bucks that are strong enough. They got the muscles to throw cows around. And it says they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. 2 kinds of offerings, burnt offerings and peace offerings. Now, burnt offerings they signified a full consecration to God. As the animal was killed, the blood was drained, and then the whole beast was consumed by the fire as a substitute for the one who offered it. Symbolic of worshiping God with your whole being. You reserve nothing. You bring the sacrifice, and it's all burned up for God. And it's like your whole life is given to God. Now, the peace offering was different. It was cooked on the altar. Part of it was burned up, but the rest, once it was, juicy and good to eat, except for the blood, was eaten then by the offerers in a meal of fellowship or reconciliation, celebrating the restoration of peace in God's presence. But now comes something very unusual. There are 2 parties to this covenant, and so Moses divides the blood of the covenant in half. 4 times blood is mentioned, so you've got to kind of get this part of it. How about altar and pillars up there I was talking about? Okay, here we go. Now, first of all, it says Moses took half of the blood, put it in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. Now, the blood that was dashed on the altar is God's portion. The life of the animal was regarded as containing the blood, and this belonged first and foremost to the life giver. Now, usually when offerings were given like this, or sacrifices, all the blood went to God. But not here. Verse 7, then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, and this for the third time, even more emphatically, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. We will hear it, and we will do what it says. In verse 8, and Moses took the blood, and so this is the other half, and this is weird. He takes the other half of the blood in the basins, and it's for the other party of the covenant. It somehow signifies their participation in it, and may also symbolize their cleansing from any transgression that would disqualify them from fellowship with God. And it says that he threw it on the people. Wow. Including Aaron and his sons and all the people, all these elders. Perhaps it was thrown on the 70 elders who represented the people, or even on the 12 pillars that also stood in their place. But it says then that, and said, this is Moses, and said, behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. Something that sounds vaguely familiar if you've ever been to the Lord's table, where Jesus said, this is my blood of the covenant. Now, this is covenant ratification. And it continues as Israel and its representatives then joins God on the mountain as instructed. Now in verse 9. So all that the Lord has spoken we will do, we will be obedient. I'm not keeping up with this. And then I put the first part of the chapter at the top because that's what we've already read that. And now what we have in verse 9 is the same thing now obeying what they had been told to do. And so in verse 9 it says, then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up as instructed, and they saw the God of Israel. And if you're an Israelite reading that, you should just fall down and say, that could never happen. How in the world did that happen? They went up to worship. It's not likely they expected to actually see the Lord halfway up. You know, we were the guys that weren't supposed to go all the way up and actually see God. Moses, only he would be allowed to come near. They would worship from afar. I imagine they had mixed feelings about getting any closer. You could tell stories about this. One I like is from H.G. Wells that he wrote in the New Yorker a long time ago. It's about an Episcopalian clergyman, denomination not important here. This bishop was the kind of man who always said pious things to people if they were, when trouble folks came to him. He thought it was a very helpful thing to suggest that they would pray about it. He would say in the right tone of voice, have you prayed about it? And if he said it in just the right way, it just seemed to calm them down and settle them. Well, the bishop himself didn't pray much because he had life well in hand without divine help. But one day, life tumbled in on him and he found himself overwhelmed. And it occurred to the bishop that maybe he should take some of his own advice. So, one Saturday afternoon, he entered the cathedral, went to the front, and knelt on the crimson carpet. And then he folded his hands before the altar. He could not help but think how childlike he was, H.G. Wells writes, and he began to pray. He said, "Oh God." And suddenly there was a voice. According to H.G. Wells, it was a crisp, businesslike voice. And the voice said, "Well, what is it?" And the next day, when the worshipers showed up for Sunday services, they found the bishop sprawled face down on the crimson carpet. They turned him over and they discovered he was dead. Lines of horror were etched on his face because the God he talked to ended up actually being alive. What H.G. Wells was saying is that you can talk a lot about God, but it might kill you if you found out he was actually real. Well, I think the men who went up that smoking mountain had no reason to think death was a remote possibility. I think coming back alive would have been the big surprise. But anyway, they were, we're going to do it from afar, so maybe we're going to be okay. But the men here in Exodus 24 do not die. Even though Moses is warned elsewhere that no one can see God and live. Chapter 33, verse 20. Later on, we're going to explore why they didn't die. But here they are, collapsed and overwhelmed on their faces in worship, very much alive, and here's what they see from their humble position. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. Now, it's possible all they saw was God's feet from that position of worship, like later when Moses saw just the back parts of God, or maybe just the afterglow of his having passed. Maybe not even God's feet then. Maybe not even actually seeing God, but it's obvious this is where he's standing, just the pavement where they knew he stood. Now, if you're a child and you read this, you would actually wonder if God has feet. And kids have been told correctly that God is invisible, he's incorporeal, he doesn't have a body. Children are told that whenever they ask, where's God? I can't see him. And we say, well, God is pure spirit. And they try to think about that. What's that about? But they're still going to ask, well, if they saw God's feet, how big were they? They want to know, is he barefooted or was he wearing sandals or Nikes? What was on his, did he have toenails? And were they well trimmed? The kids are very literal about this. Now, we know about the right hand of God, but we rarely have thought about either of his feet. Although it's not unusual in Scripture to hear about God trampling his enemies or a footstool being mentioned in Psalm 110. God speaks of his sanctuary as the place of my feet that will be made glorious in the millennial restoration, Isaiah 60. Or God tells Ezekiel that his millennial temple will be the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, Ezekiel 43:7. God's feet tell you where he is. So if you happen to see them, he's where you are, which can be kind of interesting because his feet normally symbolize something of the potential for judgment, of God's sovereignty is there. His rule, his authority. So wherever God walks is sovereignly his, victoriously his. It belongs to him, even if he has to take it by judgment. And so these guys might not be in the safest place on earth when they see the place where God is standing. Well, we're told nothing about what God's feet look like, but the floor under his feet is certainly beautiful, and there's no reason to think that God in every way is amazingly beautiful. Well, obviously, seeing God at all involves however he chooses to present himself, since he has no actual body. But here we see also God's hand mentioned, which carries the meaning of power and authority. Look at verse 11. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel to harm them, to kill them, that means. But now here comes the shocker. Far from die, they are invited to dine with him. They beheld God, something like gazed at God, and ate and drank. Now here in the presence of God, they eat the meat of the peace offering. So probably they have brought this up, as was usual with peace offerings, although not with God obviously present usually, but what they drink is your guest. But this suggests, of course, what we do when we worship at the Lord's table, eating and drinking. The meal in God's presence is the final part of the covenant ratification. If they abide by the terms of the covenant as they have vowed, then peace will continue between them. This is the meaning of the peace offerings. In those ancient cultures, and in many places today, I suppose even Liberia where we eat, sometimes with people, eating was a sort of non-aggression pact. If I feed you, it means I want you to live. You don't have to fear me. Or if I receive hospitality from you, it means I come as a friend. And so if you're going to eat with somebody, that was why it was so shocking that Judas went out and betrayed Jesus. Because the Psalm said, the one who has eaten with me has become my enemy. It's not supposed to happen that way. So eating before God is a symbol of blessing and joy and acceptance and friendship. And of course, it culminates in the Bible. We could trace this through from the Garden of Eden till the very end. The marriage supper of the Lamb is when Christ returns. And that will be the ultimate fulfilling of all these covenants. Well, the treaty is now signed, sealed, and delivered. Only one thing remains, and that's for the copies of the covenant to be installed in the sanctuaries of the two parties. And we'll talk more about that when we get to a later chapter. Well, God has something special for that. Stone tablets engraved by his own finger. And again, now we have to ask where the incorporeal God gets a finger. So he's got feet, he's got hand, he's got a finger. But anyway, these tablets will include the 10 words that are meant to be placed in the Ark of the Covenant, which has not been built yet. Moses will be, somebody was telling me this and I had to agree, Moses is the first person to download data from the cloud to be read on a tablet. All right, I didn't make that up, but that's pretty clever. Now, by verse 12, then, the worship party has gone back down the mountain. God calls Moses up to the top of the mountain again to give him those tablets and also instructions for the tabernacle where they will be kept. Now, we have some key terms that we'll get in here. We're going to have the idea of the glory of the Lord. We're going to have the idea of the cloud again. And so we'll look at that as I read. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment, which I have written for their instruction." So Moses rose with his assistant Joshua, and Joshua was probably part of that whole party that went up, but he's not mentioned, so he's sort of like the guy right at Moses' side. You could mention him or not. Usually you can expect that he's there. Moses went up into the mountain of God, and he said, and this probably means, and he had said before he went up to the elders, now, and they're at the foot of the mountain, "Wait here for us until we return to you, and behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a dispute, let him go to them, because I'm going to be gone for a while." I don't think he knew he would be gone for 40 days and 40 nights. But Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the 7th day he called Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of God. The people must increasingly wonder whether some distance between them and God was not really a pretty good idea. But we do have one man who has some experience with God and fire, and it's Moses. Remember the burning bush. So Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. And so stay tuned till next week as we study what God was telling Moses for 40 days. Now I want to talk about why we need this chapter. It describes the ratifying of a covenant that wasn't made with us. The Mosaic covenant was for the people who received the law with the vows of obedience, who were then sprinkled with the blood of that covenant and then kept the sign of that covenant, the Sabbath. These are not our laws, but this is our God. How God dealt with his people teaches us some important lessons that I want us to take home today. And first, it tells us that the center of worship involves seeing God and eating with God. A relationship with God, seeing him not just as terrible and amazing so you die, but a God who wants to come close to you and actually eat with you. And so they are there, perhaps flat on their faces, but they have come if, when, and how God wants to show himself to them or to us. We're forced to wonder what sort of seeing God this was. We're going to try to describe that. And then we want to know if it might be similar for us or the same. I want us to take the rest of our time answering 6 or 7 questions about seeing God and the heart of, and then the height of worship. And I subtitled this, Some Questions for Habitual Sin Managers. Now maybe I'm preaching to the choir and I'm singing in it myself, but I think the choir needs this today. Now I sing baritone and you probably sing a different part, but here's what the whole song sounds like. And I call it the pathetic carol of the habitual sin manager. We get up in the morning and we start humming quietly. You know, on this blessed new day, how can I do better as a Christian? And we're shaving and we say, may I sin a little less and serve a little more. And so we're going on like that, be less grumpy at breakfast, be less festy at work, be more loving when I hear somebody has a need, more generous, more compassionate, less judgmental, not so quick to blame the poor person for getting himself in a jam. I would never have gotten in this pickle in the first place, but not everyone can be as good as me. Not everyone can be as good as me. Or is it as I? I must work on my grammar, but I'll get to that tomorrow or next summer. Now, I don't know, the pathetic carol of the habitual sin manager, maybe you have sung it, or maybe it doesn't sound that pathetic. Well, you do it with your kind of music. If you've had a lust habit and you get up in the morning, you determine you've got to do better. You got to control your thoughts. I will do better, and I will also control my eating. I will be at the gym today where I can meditate and pray on the elliptical as I improve my waistline. Just be a better person overall. And that's what a good Christian does on good days. We have other days too many of them, where we just coast. We eat anything we want. We're not trying to thrive, we're just trying to survive, and it's okay for a while until you start feeling bad about yourself again. And we started up over again. Or then we love to hear, the Masters University Chorale was here on Wednesday night, and they sang in this very room. I woke up this morning with my mind. Were you here? Did you hear this? Stayed on Jesus. Do the second line with me. I woke up this morning with my mind. You're not singing. Stayed on Jesus. That's enough. Oh my. And then you think, well, I've got to do more of that. I have got to improve my spiritual concentration, my Jesus on my mind box. Next Wednesday, I'm going to start working on that. No, I've got a staff meeting early. I'll start on Thursday because I have got to check all my boxes. But to be honest, I don't really think about him that often, and I know that's a problem, and my mind is filled with me and my struggles to get better. I woke up this morning with my mind scared of sinning, not focused on his holiness, but mine. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on standing. Nothing about the guys that were flat on their face in worship, aware of their weakness and his strength, but I'm just thinking about, I got to stand up. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on my feet. I'm looking at my feet, not his. Watch my step, not his. And then I end the song with, Hallelujah, 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 me. Praise me. That's what I call habitual sin management. It's as good as we get. When we're doing well, and it feels like a soberly responsible Christian way to live. It's not wrong to try to do better as a Christian. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But it's all where the focus is. Whose glory are we so concerned about? The sin management, that carol has not got an ounce of worship in it. It's all about worshiping me. And when we're losing this battle over sin management, the carol turns into a dirge, confessions of a pathetic mismanager. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on failure. But all of that, whether I don't care, it's positive or it's negative, it is pure pagan moralism. We evidently find our life to be very interesting, worthy of practically all of our attention in our waking hours. We might say differently. I mean, when we sing it at church, Jesus is everything to me. I think I mean it. But we should probably admit that we find ourselves much more interesting than we find either God, the Father, or Jesus. The way we live is a sugar-coated blasphemy that cannot possibly be justified by even a casual reading of the Bible. I have little interest in seeing God because my vision is filled with glorifying, and if I can coin a word, with worthifying myself. Now, before I go on making us feel even worse about how our self-improvement program is going, whether good or bad, I should define what we're talking about. So, here's the first thing we're going to do. We're going to talk about what it means to see God. Well, this would have to be the loftiest thing that could ever happen to anybody. In fact, also the scariest. It's hard to imagine desiring something that is supposed to kill you if it ever happens because it is either so wonderful or dreadful. So we have this sentence, see God. In a sense, how they ever get in the same sentence together. Even God sees us. That is amazing enough. Now, if you gather up all the passages that speak about seeing God, you get a little confused. There are many passages that make it sound impossible or highly inadvisable unless you have a death wish. Impossible because God is invisible. He has no physical face. He has no body. And it's inadvisable because he is so holy. As God will put it to Moses when Moses is obsessed with seeing him, no one can see me and live. And yet there's another stream of scriptures that tells us that ordinary people have seen God. People like the despondent Hagar, or people like these chief men of Israel, who were not exactly spiritual giants, or someone like Moses, whom the writer of Hebrews says, saw him who was invisible. Or Isaiah, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. Ezekiel, Amos, you can read it through the Old Testament. What we are even told was that this was a grand blessing to see God. We should long for it as the greatest impossible thing possible. Now, some say that these men on the mountain saw not God literally, but God, sort of God's glory or a manifestation, a shining of some kind. Enough to know that they were dealing with a person there on that pavement that this, where supposedly the feet were. Maybe they didn't actually see feet. But they saw the place where God symbolically stood, not the invisible God himself in his essence. Frankly, whatever anyone sees of the invisible God, God is projecting himself in some visible way that is exactly how he wants to be seen. But sometimes it could be as a whirlwind, or a consuming fire, or an angel, or in human form, sometimes colossal. To see God literally in his essence is a contradiction in terms. So let's just go to that. And that's why we get John 1:18. No one has seen God at any time. But John doesn't end there. He goes on to identify the best and brightest vision we have of the invisible God, the one great exception that makes seeing God commonplace for all his people. No one has seen God at any time. The unique and beloved one, himself God, who is he talking about? Jesus, who is in the Father's bosom, is present tense, in the Father's bosom, always in, because Father, Son, and Spirit are always one. He has made him known. He has literally exegeted, explained, narrated God by the intimacy he has of being in his bosom and the fact that he himself is God, so by his very nature. The incarnate God-man has broken the invisibility barrier by showing God in human flesh. And that's why later he could insist to Philip, when Philip wanted to know, how do you see God? And he says, he who has seen me has seen the Father. John 14, verse 9. Jesus is the visible, tangible disclosure of God himself. And so in spite of all the mysteries that surround this idea of seeing God, we could stop right here that what anyone actually sees when they see God is the enthroned Jesus, the revealer of God, the God who has a body now once he's incarnate. And it seems that even then, God had to give men the ability to see what they can't see with divine help. Because think about that. Even to see Jesus on earth did not impress men as a vision of God unless they were given eyes to see it. They called him a demon when he was actually God. Of course, his flesh was veiled at that point. It wasn't like the Mount of Transfiguration where they stripped that away and the three close disciples of Jesus got to see Jesus shining like the sun for all his glory. But that is what we will see forever. He definitely wants us all to see him, to know him face to face. But even now it appears that Christian people get a foretaste of that future vision. And I'm not talking about dreams and visions. I'm talking about God coming up close to you as your intimate yet glorious friend. As in James 4, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. I'm talking about the eyes of your heart being enlightened, like Paul prays about in Ephesians chapter 1. Being able to know God as present with you, as your heart is exposed to the truth of God's glory and you see him as he really is. And there you're awestruck by his holy glory and comforted by his grace. And then you see glimpses of God everywhere. In nature, in Scripture, in his body, the church, and always in the workings of his good providence. You read God into every chapter of your life because he is always there. Almost everywhere you look, there he is. Once your eyes have been opened. But we must ask if this is a special vision for people who need that sort of thing, or is it for everybody? Well, not if you're a non-Christian, as you're going to see in a minute. Some people say, well, you just have to have an eye for it, like certain Christians can see that. Of course, they see the Virgin Mary and, in a cloud sometimes, whatever. I'm not talking about that. But I do want to put the question like this. What's so important about seeing God? And somebody could say, well, I don't really need that. I can get along without that. Well, think about this. First of all, think of the amazing ingratitude it would be that you don't even want to see your Father or to see the Savior who made you walk again. But far above that, it's important because it is important to God that we know him and see him. He wants us all to see him. And so I'm going to read this little section from 2 Corinthians 4, chapter that comes right after Paul tells about Moses' face glowing, and we're going to run on into that in a later chapter, so I'm not going to read that part. But you tell me if this sounds like something that's for a super saint, or is it something that all Christians are supposed to see? So starting with verse 3. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. Who would that be? Well, he tells you in the next verse. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Now, there are two things going on. If you're going to see God, it can be seen by those who are not blinded and those who are also enlightened in their eyes. In other words, the blindness is taken away. So you've got to have that. So in their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing, listen to this string of words, the light of the gospel, of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. You want to see God, you see him. For what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ is Lord, with ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. I love that passage. And that pretty much defines what a Christian is. It's someone who can see God when they see Jesus, and they see Jesus by faith. God is seeking worshipers. Jesus tells a woman at the well, God is seeking her and wants her so much that here is God sending his son to that well to invite this immoral, ethnically despised, thirsty woman just to come and know him and worship him in spirit and in truth. And you can say, well, I can do without that, but this is really not about you. Worship is not for you, it is for God. When we worship, we come to God for his enjoyment and honor, and not ours, and it is his delight to show himself to us. Like a bride coming down the aisle, he would be the groom more like, but I just think of, we're going to read from Isaiah chapter 6, his train filled the temple. That's like a bride. And his glory is that way, and he shows himself to us for our enjoyment and for his. We're not the audience in worship. We often talk about this as if we're the spectators in need of entertainment. No, God is the audience, and he calls us together to see him, to adore him, to bless his holy name. Does this help us in any way? Well, immeasurably, but that's not the main goal. It does keep us from drinking out of broken cisterns that contain nothing that can quench our thirst for the living God. Because if we don't worship him, then we don't worship nothing. We worship anything, and we worship even ourselves. And that's where the pathetic carol of the habitual sin manager comes from. The driving desire to make ourselves into something we can respect. That's our form of worship too often. Now Jesus offers something better. He says this, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him, and he with me." Look how he comes knocking. On Sinai, he came down to the halfway gang who expected things to be out of distance, and he surprised them there, and they saw him, and they ate and drank. Now, what keeps you from seeing God or even wanting to see God? Well, there's nagging little impediments that we call sins, selfishness, self-satisfaction. We have divided minds. There's how Jesus put it in the Beatitudes. Happy are the pure in heart, for they will see God. They'll see God, but it comes to those that are pure in heart. Well, what does that mean? I've never been that pure, I don't think. Well, according to Kierkegaard, the way he liked to say it was purity of heart is to will one thing. It's the undivided heart. It's the heart that's just aimed at God. Not perfection, but the heart that just says, whatever I am doing in my life, it's going to be for God. You pursue the Lord. And when that's your heart, Jesus says, you get what you want. You get to see God, because he is the goal of the heart of purity. You see God. Seeing God is the reward of wanting God above all else. And if you want to see God, to approach him and live with him, you do leave your idols behind, even the idol of becoming good. Being satisfied with being the nice guy, the best Christian you know, the responsible citizen, the hard worker, the great family man, all the while being oblivious to the fact that you hardly ever feel any longing to know and see and delight in God. We have to leave that behind. We have divided hearts. Sometimes I pick this up when I'm talking to somebody and they start talking about their desire to go to heaven, which I think is wonderful. So when I die, and I'm not afraid of dying and then they start describing what that will be like, and what they describe is this: departed loved ones that they want to see. Like maybe God will be so kind as to gather them all up in a little reception party at the pearly gates so they can have this, this welcome party. How wonderful it would be that the first people you will see, it would be so nice not to have to go looking for them among the millions of souls. But there they will be. And if we start thinking like that, here's what that tells me. We miss them. We want to see them more than we miss God and want to see him. How is it that we don't have a paramount and nearly obsessive desire to see God, who didn't kill me for all the things I did against him, and instead he lets me into his home? Why is it that you could possibly put anyone ahead of seeing the Savior who didn't kill you but instead died for you, who was above all others desirable and glorious? So that's what I want to see here in this question. What do you expect to see when you see God? And I'm just going to read this little section from Isaiah 6. You're going to see what Isaiah saw. You'll see much more. You're going to see everything that Jesus is. I mean, you can't even put into words all that's involved, but here's how he put it. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne. A throne, that's his regal authority. High and lifted up, there's his supreme power. And the train of his robe filled the temple. There is his incomparable splendor. Above him stood the seraphim. He is revered. Each seraphim had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. So here is God. He is holy, he is unlike any other, infinitely worthy of all praise. The whole earth is full of his glory. So he is glorious beyond everything, and his glory covers all that is. In verse 4, and the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. And what he sees is that God is immensely glorious, and we are not. And we don't have to be. You see all of that. And what keeps you from dying when you see that? Well, would God have invited these men up the mountain just to expose them and then kill them? Of course not. He had every right to, because they were not worthy of his presence, not one of them, not Moses, not Nadab and Abihu. Come on. I mean, Aaron, look at what he is doing 40 days later approximately, helping Israel make a golden calf because they whined for it. 70 elders represent the crowds of grumblers. All these men deserve to die. Not get a vision of a glorious God and have dinner with him. The men on the mountain, but they didn't die. And they didn't die for one reason, because of the blood. The sacrifices that meant that God accepted another death in their place. They were cleansed by that blood. They accepted that sacrifice on their behalf when they submitted to that blood being sprinkled or thrown on them, just as when they put the blood on the doorposts when, at the Passover, saved their firstborns. The thing that saved them was when the same then is now for us, innocent blood poured out on our behalf and now applied to our hearts. Jesus died for me and sprinkled me with his blood. Hebrews chapter 12, so that I can see him and not die, but eat with him. Hebrews 10:22, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart, in full assurance of faith. This is the call to worship. Having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience. And so this is where real purity comes from, without which no one will see the Lord. This is the blood that keeps on cleansing us from all sin. This is why our eating and drinking at the Lord's table is possible, because it is anchored in a commemoration of a sacrifice of blood, the offering of an innocent lamb for guilty worshipers. This is the new covenant in my blood. Last question. 2 questions. What makes God want you to see him, and what is he willing to pay to get an audience and a lunch with you? We all know the answer to that. It is grace alone. That's what makes God want you to see him. He knows your soul was designed to feed on nothing else but him and his words, and God cannot give us a happiness and a peace apart from himself, because that does not exist. There is no such thing. So what he is willing to pay to get an audience and a lunch with you, we all know what that is. It is the death of his son. And so he's the celebrity, and he's paying to see us. This is amazing. So Jesus, think about him. He would rather kill himself than kill you. That is grace. And that is his choice, to make us known in him, to make known to us in him the greatest of all delights. Now, what are you willing to pay? So that's the other part of this. For the same thing, for an audience with the Almighty. Well, I'll just say forget it. How much does God charge for you to meet him backstage? You do not have enough to pay for that, do you? You couldn't pay for it. It would cost you everything, and it still wouldn't be enough. So God has to pay the price, because he will not live without you. He pays to meet you. So God just asks you to want it, to want him as your unfathomable delight. And for that, you just have to learn that God is vastly greater than everything else that there is, that nothing else could ever make you satisfied. Not you becoming good, not you meeting celebrities, not you being incredibly, fabulously rich and successful in everything you ever do. None of that will ever satisfy you. God is looking for a heart that is completely his, and that heart sounds like this. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on Jesus. That's the whole thing. And in reality, God gets up each eternal morning with his mind stayed on you. Do you know that? He knows your name like no celebrity does. He sees you all day long because you are precious to him. That's another reason you want to see him. I don't have time to read this story, but I'm going to do it anyway. Forgive me for going a little longer. Jennifer Rothschild was diagnosed at 15 with a rare eye disease that would eventually steal her sight. And so she was very interested to know how this went with other people. And in her study, Fingerprints of God, Jennifer shared the following story about another blind woman. It was a very crowded bus, and all the passengers looked sympathetically at Susan as she made her way down the aisle. She fumbled with her cane, and as she nestled herself into her seat, the onlookers just watched with questions and concern. You see, it had been a year since Susan had lost her sight. When she first became blind, she fell into a deep pit of depression. Her world had crumbled. Her sadness overtook her. Not only was her heart crushed, but so was the heart of her husband, Mark. He so loved his wife, and he wanted to help her, and so he did. Inch by inch, he helped her pull out of that pit and helped give her skills and confidence and to regain her sense of self. And that husband, so in love with his wife, did all he could to help her in her new state of darkness. Well, after many months of Susan's blindness, she began to feel more confident because of Mark's help, and she felt like she could perhaps return to her job again. Mark promised that he would help her, of course, with that also. So every day, Mark would drive his wife to work, walk her into her office, make sure that she was settled, and then leave and go to his base that was across town because Mark was a military officer. And then he would come back and get her from work. And with every day, though Mark so wanted to help his wife, the burden was becoming heavier because it was becoming logistically impossible for him to make it to his base on time. He dreaded having to announce to Susan that he wasn't going to be able to drive her to work. But in the end, he had to. "Well, I can't ride the bus to work," she replied. "I'm blind. How am I going to know how many stairs there are? How am I going to know what path to take? I feel like you're abandoning me." And Mark's heart was crushed. He promised her, like he had done from the very beginning, that he would do whatever it took to help her until she felt confident and independent on the bus. He helped her with the routes. He helped her learn the stairs and learn the paths. And so finally, Susan was confident. He went to his base. She went off to her work. Monday morning, she got on the bus. She went to work. She came home. It was flawless. Then Friday morning arrived. Susan made her way onto the bus, and as she went to pay her fare, the bus driver said, "Ma'am, you are sure lucky." Susan said, "Are you talking to me?" And the bus driver said, "Yeah, it must feel good to be cared for as you are." Susan replied, "I don't know what you mean, sir." And the bus driver said, "Well, you know, every morning when I drop you off at your stop, as soon as the doors open, I can see a man standing over there at the corner. And he watches you. And as soon as you step off the bus, his eyes are on you. I think he's some kind of military officer because of his uniform, and his eyes follow you. as you walk across that parking lot, and his eyes don't leave you as you're trying to walk up those stairs. And when your hand touches the doorknob, his eyes are on you until you open that door and go inside. That man does not take his eyes off you. And once that door closes, he stands straight and tall like a sentinel, and he salutes you. And then he blows you a kiss. And Susan burst into tears. She had no idea that her husband had been watching her. But the lover of her soul never takes his eyes off of her. Now you see, getting forgiveness and living a clean life is not a life worth living. We got kids coming in here, so I'm going to finish this. In fact, I'm just going to finish with a prayer. So if you can all bow in prayer with me, because this is going to be from the Bible. It's a prayer of Paul for the Colossian Christians. You see, a life worth living is a life, yeah, it's growing, it's all of that, but it will always be with our eyes open to admire a living God. So with your eyes closed, let's go with me through this. And so from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, for all endurance and patience with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in life. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. Amen.